Well, hello. It is so good to see you for another Bible story time. Remember last time we talked, we were talking about Gideon. God had chosen Gideon to help rescue Israel from the Midianites. Remember this? And we talked about 2 stories ago about how Gideon was the youngest member of the smallest family in the weakest and smallest tribe, and that God promised that God would be with him and help him. So Gideon started by pulling down the altar of Baal. You remember that. And then last week we talked about how Gideon had a moment where he was afraid and he asked God to help him feel braver. Remember the thing with the fleece? That in the first place, Gideon said, would it be possible, Lord, I'll put a fleece on my threshing floor, and if it's wet with dew in the morning and all the ground around it is dry, I'll know that you're with me and that this isn't something I'm just making up. And the Lord did that, and Gideon then asked him for the opposite result the next night. How about if the fleece is dry and the ground is wet? And God did that for him too. And when we left last week, Gideon had put out a call for the soldiers, the men of Israel, to come and to drive out the Midianites. Well, 32,000 soldiers answered Gideon's call. 32,000 is a lot. And the good Lord looked down and he said to Gideon, hey, there's a lot of soldiers there. Gideon said, yep, 32,000. God said, I can count. That's too many soldiers. When we drive the Midianites out of the land, I don't want the men of Israel saying that they did it, how strong they were. I want them to know that I did this, that I helped them. And Gideon said, well, okay, what should I do? And God said, call the men together and tell any of them who are afraid that they can go home. Oh, really? Yeah. So Gideon called all the men together, 32,000 soldiers, and he said, now listen, boys, God's got this. If any of you are afraid, if any of you are worried about it, there's no shame in that, there's no harm in that. You can go home. And the guys looked at each other, and they thought about it, and 22,000 of them went home, leaving 10,000 soldiers for Gideon against the whole might of the Midianites. And God said to Gideon, Gideon, that's still too many soldiers. And Gideon said, what? And God said, yep, still too many. Tell you what, take them down by the river. And guys who just throw their weapons down and drink from the river, whether they're using both hands or whether they throw their bodies, their bellies on the ground and lap like dogs, you send all them home. Only keep the guys that kneel down to drink and alertly hold their weapons in one hand and drink from the other hand while keeping their guard up. Okay. So Gideon did that, and they sorted he and his captains sorted the men as they were drinking, and there were only 300 men left after they did that sorting. They sent home 9,700 more men. 300. It didn't even look like an army anymore. It looked like a club. It looked like some guys out for a walk. It was very, very strange. But Gideon trusted that God had a plan and that God was going to do what God said. So that night, God said to Gideon, if you want a little more reassurance, why don't you and your servants sneak into the Midianites' camp and listen to what you hear? So Gideon and his servant did that, and they stood outside a tent and they eavesdropped. They listened to what was going on in the tent, and there was a man in the tent talking about a dream he had, and someone else gave him an interpretation of the dream that said that dream means that God is going to use Gideon to destroy us. And Gideon knew that the armies of the Midianites were terrified of what God was going to do. And with a little smile, maybe a big smile, he and his servant snuck back out of the camp. So Gideon took his 300 men and he organized them into 3 companies of 100 men each. And he gave each man a trumpet and a pitcher, a pottery container that inside it had a smoldering torch. And they spread out around the Midianite camp in the middle of the night in the deep darkness, where all of the Midianite soldiers were asleep except for the watchmen. Now you remember, at this point in history, there's no searchlights, there's no infrared vision, dark is dark, there's no light of any kind. And in the darkness, these 300 soldiers of Israel, Gideon's 300 men, were gathered and they waited for a signal. So at midnight, Gideon blew a long blast on his trumpet, and all of the other 300 men broke their pitchers, and the torches flared into life. So suddenly the Midianite camp was surrounded by all of this light, all of these torches. They couldn't see anything but the torches. When they'd look at them, they couldn't see if there were men out there, but all of those men also blew their trumpets, and it sounded like there was an enormous army coming at them out of the darkness. And the Midianite soldiers panicked. They ran around in the dark. They trampled one another. They fell on their weapons. They cut themselves. They injured themselves. Many of them died. They broke camp and they ran away. Now there were other people of Israel, other men of Israel, who chased them all through the countryside. They killed many of those men. They killed the princes of the Midianites and 2 of their kings. It was an enormous victory. 300 men. God's power. Now, when Gideon and his men came back, the people of Israel wanted to make him a king. He said, "We'll make you a king. Your son, your grandsons will rule over us." And Gideon said, "Absolutely not. The Lord is going to rule over us. I'm not going to do it. My sons aren't going to do it. The Lord is in charge around here." And for 40 years, Gideon was a judge over Israel. For 40 years, there was peace in the land. The Midianites didn't trouble Israel anymore. And the people remembered how they were supposed to live. Pretty cool story, isn't it? All right, I'll see you next week. God bless. Bye-bye.